Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Questions and Answers on American Calvinism. Wow, and there were a lot of questions. Thanks very much for all of those. I doubt we'll be able to get to all of them, but Jeremy's got a bunch for us. Thanks, Jeremy. Welcome.
Hey, Wes.
Yeah, and before we start, I just want to say thanks to the people who've signed up for the class. The website is working now, and you can actually pay. Wow, this is both great. This is a great innovation over here. I'm hugely technically savvy. Oh my gosh, so unsavvy. But it's working now thanks to my webmaster lady. She's doing excellent work for me. So please sign up soon. We got people signed up. I say please sign up soon just because I get nervous. So it should be fine, but just sort of nerve-wracking for me every time. But anyway, so I'll put the link below. Thanks very much to everybody, and yeah, let's get rolling. Jeremy, you're up.
The first question is from Deanna, and she asks, the crew of the Mayflower were simple Church of England Christians who did their duty with complacent faith. They loathed the pilgrims who even left childcare and personal work to the crew, arguing incessantly over Bible verses. Was there a big difference between the different sects of sort of Protestant people at the time, or was everyone Calvinist?
Yeah, so this is a big. I don't know actually about the social dynamics on the Mayflower, but this would not surprise me because that would be representative of the social dynamics that were going on. So the Church of England so you had the sort of the Calvinist Protestant Reform movement was at times aligned with, but often at war with the Church of England because they were nonconformists. And so this is why you get the universities in Scotland, because they were set up as nonconformist schools. So at Oxford and Cambridge, just as an example from educational history, but this was true throughout the government, any government position, you had to take confession of Anglican faith to be able to be a professor, to serve in government, to be elected to parliament, right? They had all of these religious restrictions all around the Church of England. However, that had originally been in place because of Catholicism, right? But then as the nonconformists, the Methodists, and the Calvinists, all this starts becoming more prominent, is essentially you got applied to them as well. So there was a lot of friction, a lot being capital A, capital lot, of friction between English Puritanism and English, I guess you would call it the Church of England, right? Just sort of the establishment church, which really was the religion of the establishment. Again, with this overlay of there was still this traditional Catholic minority that just kept traveling along. I mean, if they're crypto-Catholic or actually, quietly practicing Catholic, it varied by period. But yeah, so yes, there was a huge amount of religious friction. The Puritans were not very much tolerated. They were persecuted to a fair amount. And so one reason they wanted to come to the United States is to be able to freely enforce Puritanism on other people, if that makes sense. One of the things I didn't like about England is they couldn't force other people to be Puritans. And so they thought that was terrible. And so they wanted to go someplace where they could have the freedom to force other people to be like them, sort of. But again, city on the hill. This was an attempt to go to the promised land and found a new society that was going to be the city on the hill. So yeah.
Okay. And was the Church of England influenced by Calvin? I mean, was that the central reason that they broke away from Catholicism, or was that a separate?
No. So this is back to English theological history. The Church of England was founded because Henry VIII was basically at war with the power of the Catholic Church. And so he wanted to break that power. It had to do with dynastic marriages, had to do a lot of things. But I think fundamentally it was a power struggle. Who's in charge in England? Is it the king or is it the Pope? And what he realized is if he makes himself the head of the church, then he gets the power over the church as well as the power over secular, if you will, issues. And so it was really a power grab and a money grab, by the way. This came with a lot of money and revenue and such. So there were a lot of forces leading to this. And by the way, this is why the Reformation worked. I mean, Luther had no ideas that hadn't been around for a long time. He wasn't an original thinker in many ways, but he was a very clear and cogent thinker, but so as not throwing rocks at Luther. But what he did is it happened at a time when the German princes, one, they needed revenue. the church was taking a lot of revenue, and they felt increasingly oppressed by the Catholic structure. And so he had allies in the political class, which is what everybody else sort of had lacked before. And so the Reformation is able to roll because you had political forces aligning with the religious reform movement against the power of the Catholic Church. So it was similar in that way. If you think of it as a political and power revolution rather than a religious revolution, you're closer. But of course, it had a religious element.
It kind of dovetailed with the political stuff going on.
Yeah, and then later, then you get the Calvinist impulse, and this is why England tended to side with the Puritans, but it was it was off and on with the Calvinists and the Dutch lowland. I mean, it was sometimes yes, sometimes no, a vexed love affair.
Okay, and on the Mayflower, was it primarily Puritans? Or
yes.
were there?
Yes. So again, this is when the Mayflowers were not necessarily representative of all the early settlers, and this is the problem with American history: is they're always presented as, oh, like the early settlers came over, they were the Puritans. Well, this is incorrect. However, the Mayflower was. I should check the numbers, but I'm. It's easy to check. Everybody check for yourself. So I don't want to make any strong statements here, but I believe it was a plurality was Puritans coming over, and I didn't, but I didn't think of the crew. So this is a good statement. So again, I don't know exactly what was happening, social dynamics, but that would be representative of what was happening in England at the time.
Okay, and Robert asks, why is Calvinism so fundamental across the American political spectrum? Why isn't it discussed as a root issue? Have other movements like Unitarianism, and I think Robert's trying to say, Methodists or Lutherans or all of the variety of Protestants, why haven't they tried to uproot and replace it?
So yeah, this is a good question. I mean, this is a great question, by the way. I appreciate all these questions because I was telling Jeremy earlier before we came on that it makes me feel not alone in the world when people are asking questions about sort of the origin and evolution of theological and political and social ideas, because this is what I find endlessly fascinating, of course. So I love this kind of stuff. So this is one, Calvinism disappears. I mean, there are Calvinist sects, so it's not disappeared completely, but it's one of these things where it's just absorbed into the culture so completely that it's like somebody arguing and saying, we should really use cash money. And it's like, why would you argue that, right? Even if you did believe it and you think it's a good thing, you don't really argue it because everybody agrees with you, or 95% of people agree with you. Some people think we should get rid of it, but but it's such a common majority position that it doesn't need arguing for. And so what happens with a lot of these Calvinists, not all of Calvinists' idea, by the way, but the ones that get adopted, they just they get into the water, they get into the soil, and so we take them so for granted that we no longer recognize that these are original ideas. And so we could say, oh, let's be Methodist, let's be this, let's be that, but it really wouldn't matter because it's all tinged in this flavor of the Reformed Calvinist tradition. Even hilariously, Unitarians fall into this. So it's hard for us to break out of that because it's so pervasive in our society. Like I said, if you just think about the central claim, which, by the way, was St. Augustine, not Thomas Aquinas. Sorry about that mistake. Obviously, it's St. Augustine that I meant, who also wrote the book, City on the Hill, blah, blah, blah. City of God, which is the city on the hill. In the early version, he's got everything there in, 400-ish AD. But it's just pervasive. But if you got rid of this concept of that people are flawed, that would be a real attack on Calvinism. But I've never heard anybody make this claim in any serious way that resonated communally. And it's because we just, like the Methodists, don't make this argument, because then you don't need Jesus. Because why do you need Jesus? If you're not flawed and a sinner when you're born, you don't need forgiveness. So de facto, it's all good. So all these other sects are really offshoots of and have imbibed the Calvinism as much as anybody else.
And does that extend to later immigration, like in the 1800s when Irish and German and Italian immigrants are coming? Had it absorbed in Europe enough to
Yeah.
come over and already be still Calvinist in the way you're talking about it with early settlers?
Well, and I think this is the important thing that I'm sort of probably driving at inefficiently is, so when you reach America, if you think in the Calvinist Protestant split is perfect for this. This is why Calvinism is so, I mean, Calvinist Catholic split is perfect for this. This is why it's so powerful. If you come from a Catholic society,
Mm-hmm.
it is, you are immersed in Catholicism completely, day to day, hour by hour. The Catholic Church is there, and it's controlling lots of things. It's a lot, generally your educational institutions, even in the 1800s, right? This is still a huge, powerful force, a communal shaping force. And then you come to the United States. If you live in a Catholic enclave, you might feel similarly, but as people move, there are very few places in the United States where you have these powerful, large Catholic conclaves or enclaves. And so you go, oh, okay, I moved out west. I'm an Irish settler. I moved out west. Even if you say you're still Catholic, because of the transformation of the societal elements around you,
Mm-hmm.
you start to imbibe these individualism, kind of ideals, this more personal relationship with God, this sort of how do I demonstrate that I am somebody important? And this is why you become individualistic, more materialistic than you would be if you were back in a traditional Catholic city in Ireland. In fact, I've talked to Irish people about this, and they said this is a great example. It just popped in my mind. I was talking to a gentleman from Ireland, and he said that in his town, the little town that he lived in, one of the people he grew up and knew did very well for himself, kind of moved to the bigger city, made money, but he came back and he owned a Mercedes, but he would never drive it into town.
Mm-hmm.
So he would park it at his house outside of town, and he had an old car he'd drive into town, because to show up in his little village that where everybody knew him and had always known him in a Mercedes would have just been unthinkable.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Like you can't, you just, it would have been such a like showing off, and who do you think you are? And they said everybody would just rubbish you and abuse you, and it would be terrible. He said
Mm-hmm.
you couldn't do it,
Mm-hmm.
which is roughly speaking the opposite. The whole point of having the Mercedes in the United States with the big, Mercedes symbol on it is so everybody knows that you're doing well.
I see.
Right. And so even if you are an Irish Catholic, first generation, second generation, third generation, right, you're not in that pure Catholic community, you're in all these other forces are around you, and so you imbibe it along with everybody else. Yeah.
Right. And back to Robert's question, who asked about why is Calvinism so fundamental across the American political spectrum? I think that nowadays we use the word Protestantism and we rarely hear the word Calvinism, so it sounds fresh. But we're aware of the term Protestant work ethic, and we're really not saying the word Calvin at all in American society. So a lot of the questions that came in, there was a lot of surprise about, why is Calvinism so fundamental? And is part of it because the word Calvinism is sort of interchangeable with the word Protestant that we use now?
One, it is sort of interchangeable, but two, it's because Calvin is really the guy that created the model that the Puritans were operating under. He was just hugely influential. So, Lutheranism, you have all the Protestantisms, right? And so you could just say, oh, American Protestantism. But I think if you look at the doctrines and the physical incarnation, this is why I think Calvin is so interesting and is important. It's because he had a city, Geneva, that he ran successfully. Define success, but it seemed to go along for a while, and it kind of worked. And so people were hugely influenced by it because he wasn't just writing, but lots of thinkers visited Geneva, an endless stream of people going, oh my gosh, you've pulled it off. You've created the city on the hill. We want to see it. We want to know how it's done. And so his influence by example, by works, and by all the people who came, visited, and then left to try and copy what he had done is just extraordinary. And so in particularly in the flavor of the Puritans that came to the United States, and what is extracted from his particular version of Protestantism, which is this notion of not everybody says that predestination, of course, is not universal in Protestantism, but it is a fundamental Calvinist doctrine. And the fact that you're judged communally is not universal in Protestant faith, but it is in Calvinism, right? So these elements that they brought over are hugely important, I would say, in shaping the American experience. And while we have all the other Protestantisms, the underlying current in American culture comes from the Calvin.
All right. And A Surrealist World asks kind of a long question. They say, the influence of Calvinism on American cultural history is an interesting notion to explore, but I feel this presentation is a little discontinuous. The speaker starts with pre-US American history, how Calvinism manifested itself within Puritan culture, then jumps all the way to 21st century to try to explain modern American cultural phenomenon. It would be interesting to hear more about how it endured the American Revolution, the Civil War, and the 20th century, etc. So how did Calvinism sort of, I know you said it was just absorbed in the culture, but how did it kind of stick around so strongly as like you said, all kinds of other immigrants are coming and all kinds of different things are happening in America?
Yeah, and one, that's a fair critique, because I'm trying to cover so much ground in roughly an hour, right? So fair enough. So it's totally accurate. I don't want to disagree with that at all. Just say time constraints, right? You have to pick and choose. But I think the clearest example, and this is why I tried to start with the individualism and the materialism as my first two starting points. If you ask people about America, they will invariably cite the individualism and materialism. These are the two things that people who visit here go back historically. And these elements, again, the physical and political history of the United States reinforce materialism and individualism, which are two very important elements of Calvinism. And so what happens is you get this just sort of reinforcing cycle. So if to break Calvinism, you would almost have to break individualism and or materialism, because they're so strongly linked. And so I'd say that is what keeps Calvinist rolling. And then particularly when it turns into this wealth doctrine, like the work hard, prove yourself, become wealthy, you are blessed by God. Also weaves in with American exceptionalism, because there was a very strong Puritan belief that America was the new promised land. It was the new Israel. They literally use this language. And so this time we're going to get it right. This time we're going to create God's paradise on earth. Again, the city on the hill that I keep citing. And that concept, even though 100, 200 years passes, we have a Civil War, we have an American Revolution, that outlook and that language and these concepts, they just don't ever go away. They're still with us today. That's why I said both Reagan and Kennedy, two very different politicians, can use the exact same rhetoric that Cotton Mather was using, that Calvin was using, that St. Augustine was using, because it had just been so woven into the fabric of American culture that people didn't recognize anymore that, oh, this is just pure Calvinist doctrine. And but it resonates with us because it's so just in our culture that we go, oh, sure, that sounds good, that feels good, that's psychologically resonant, it's politically powerful. It's not a logical argument, it's not a reasonable argument, it's a political resonant argument.
Chemistry Mickey asks, while I don't disagree with any of your arguments, why would a prosperity doctrine win out against a, quote, poverty doctrine as a proxy for expressing how saved you are in the eyes of Jesus? Is it just a survivorship basis? Presumably a particularly fecund or wealthy group is more likely to survive as compared to an abstinent or poor one. So, and the Bible has the meek shall inherit the earth kind of a feel to it that is often popular in Christian sects. So what was why did prosperity win out naturally?
Maybe it is a survivorship bias, but part of it, you can look at a great contrast would be with Pennsylvania, which was it Pennsylvania that was set up for the Quakers? Penn,
Yes.
The Penn family. Yeah, it was the Penn family that got the land personally. By the way, it was their personal state, which is always, hence Pennsylvania, land of the Pencils, the Penn people. And they were set up as Quakers, and Quakers were very much on that end of the, be meek, be poor, be community oriented, that is very much a version of anti-Calvinist Protestantism, if you want to call it that.
Mm-hmm.
And today in the United States, there's a few Quakers, and there's 100 million Protestant, right? Like 150 million Protestants, right? So it turns out that the meek doctrine is always been around, has been around, right? And it is there, but it is, I can't think of the meekness and seeking poverty just doesn't seem to work as well. Also, I think when you have so much material abundance possible,
Mm-hmm.
it's hard for that doctrine to win out. I think it's a doctrine that makes more sense when resources are scarce and people can see like, oh, dividing this fairly is really going to be important for everyone's survival, as opposed to an environment where people perceive the world to be, overwhelmingly abundant, in which case you're like,
Mm-hmm.
work and take yours, and then everything works out. Further, it's important to remember that, it's a cliche, but it is a true cliche that, America, a nation of immigrants, why were people coming here?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Why would you go? I mean, and again, it's hard for us to even mention. I don't claim to be able to do this, but I try to imagine this all the time. There's no TV, there's no radio, there's some illustrated newspapers at best, if you're literate, which you may not be. And somebody says, over there, which is, say 3 months of travel away, is a land where you can just live a better life, right? You should go. Think about this, right? So I'm going to just pack up, get rid of everything I have, probably have to sell everything, maybe even make myself an indentured servant. So selling myself so that I can go to someplace I've never been.
Mm-hmm.
So who are these people? For some reason, they're driven to try and change their lives, quote, for the better. And I think if they wanted to be meek and poor, probably they were good where they were.
Mm-hmm.
So it's sort of, and maybe it's just a selection bias for the people who ended up being here, right? Many of them were motivated by this. And it is the relatively few people who were willing to take this titanic risk and leap into the dark.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in some ways, impressive, amazing leap that they took. And so I think if you think of it that way, I just think it's unlikely for the poverty and meek argument to win against the let's be the chosen of God by being wealthy argument.
Mm-hmm. And does Catholicism cozy up closer to the poverty doctrine?
Catholicism in the old world versus Catholicism in the new world. I mean, of course, this had a big problem, right? I mean, this was a constant battle in the Catholic Church between the wealth of the Vatican, famous the whore of Babylon. That's what they called the Pope, because the Rome was so famously corrupt and wealthy. Corrupt and wealthy. It's a nice combination. However, and this is why it's something that read the Canterbury Tales here, because you have the friars who were generally looked on, you had the priests, you had lay fathers, right? You had this whole range. So the Catholic Church just wasn't the evil bishop just skimming cash and having 7 young attractive housekeepers in his grand mansion. That was a famous problem, but not just it. But you did, of course, had all kinds. St. Thomas of Assisi preaching poverty. Let's get rid of all this. So this was a constant tension and battle within the Catholic Church. But I do think when you look at the monastic movements, they tended to, you give up all your worldly possessions, but then over time, a lot of the monasteries got super rich. So it was, always this weird mix. But not to the degree, as far as I know, I could check this, but outside the United States, I'm not aware that Catholicism ever went down the pure, wealth doctrine route.
Mm-hmm. John asks a question about double predestination and its relationship to American exceptionalism. And double predestination is something in Calvinism which says that God not only is active in choosing the select, but also takes an active role in choosing who is damned. So because of that, you're very much trying to be in the select group, and so therefore the city on the hill, and the idea is that you might try to create a community that's really serious about preserving those values.
Yeah.
Is there something to that?
I think so. And because I think what's interesting here is, in theory, Calvinist doctrine, if you read it very strictly, he says there's nothing you can do. God is chosen. Of course, you can't convince God, right? What are you going to do? Go,
Right.
hey, God, let's negotiate. Like, no, this is not what the God of Calvin does. And the fact that if you're chosen, there's nothing you can do to get unchosen, right? Like, God is so powerful that you will eventually come around. So there's no escaping this. So in theory, if you read it strictly, this shouldn't matter. People shouldn't need to do anything. Functionally, however, what happened is, in Geneva with Calvin, this whole notion of being worked, being recognized, immediately came to the fore. And so creating and living in the correct place where you were chosen is American exceptionalism underlined twice, because this is the new country. This is the new way. This is the new place where this time we're going to get it right. And America is exceptional for that. We're chosen by God to be in this place and found the worldly kingdom that will represent his works on earth. And that has been a strong message throughout American history and is a strong message today, right? This is the, it still resonates, and this resonates on both left and right. Like, this notion that America is this unique, exceptional, totally, we're not subject to the whims of history. We shape the destiny of the planet. All these kinds of concepts are absolutely still with us.
And why did American Calvinists feel that they could influence God? Like, why were they? Why did that come into their mind?
They didn't think they were influencing God, although, of course, I'm sure they probably did. The idea is that you're demonstrating your selectedness, right? It's sort of you're performing as if you're a member of the elect, and that sort of proves that you're a member of the elect. And then the other people say, oh, look how good Jeremy is. Jeremy must be a member of the elect. And so it's this big feedback loop where we all tell each other that certainly we're the people who are members of the elect. But still, remember, it is always a personal relationship with God, which is very important to remember. Like, it's you and God alone in theory. In practice, of course, it's all communal. Again, they rebuilt the community structure.
Okay. Some listeners push back on the idea that all of these values were Calvinist on their own, like these values weren't unique to Calvinism. And so what about what about secular influences that kind of dovetailed some of these similar ideas, like Adam Smith and John Locke? One commenter says, if you were prosperous, you were helping others, Adam Smith. So sort of citing other people.
Yeah. So this is so on one. Yes. I mean, I'm using Calvin sort of as a shorthand here for this very powerful, because he powerfully embodied these ideas. Like Luther, he didn't necessarily come up with all these ideas, they're not original with him, but he kind of weaves them together into this new mix that is important, and you have to call it something. And so, Calvinism or Lutheranism. So on one hand, yes. However, this is sort of a thought trap, and this is a really not tricky, but this is how deep this stuff is. The whole notion that John Locke and Adam Smith are secular thinkers is a Calvinist idea, right? This comes from the Reformation, my friend. Like it's so before the Reformation, whatever thinking you were doing was religious thinking. Non-religious thinking would simply be heresy, and we would kill you. If you were thinking wrongly enough, well, then the Catholic Church would burn you at the stake. But that was almost invariably a political power question, rather than like, oh, I think that the king should collect the taxes or whatever. Like it's when you threaten the power of the church that they decided you were a heretic who needed to be burnt. But the notion that there was non-religious thinking is um, secularism basically is in large part, a product of the Reformation, because the Reformation said you have an individual relationship with God. Therefore, you might have a different relationship with your prince. So your prince of your district is not the leader of the church. He's the leader of the secular power. He is the guy that collects the taxes and runs the army. That concept is really, really brought to the fore during the Protestant Reformation, and then extrapolated out from there, so that when you have thinkers like Locke and Smith, who were definitely products of the Enlightenment, but the space they're occupying is to say, oh, there's certain things you argue about that aren't theological, and there are certain things you argue about that are theological, as opposed to most religious society, or many religious societies, fundamental Islamic societies today, just simply don't understand this argument. Functionally, Hindu society doesn't understand this argument. They're like, okay, God created the world. How could you do something that wasn't whatever you're thinking theologically? Like, there is only theology, because everything is about God, God's world, God's people, how God wants things to be done. All other questions are just sort of, what would that mean? It's a meaningless concept, right? To talk about things that don't have something to do with God. So what you get with the Protestant Reformation is a dramatic increase in the opportunity to have this space where people are like, oh, you have a personal relationship with God. So all this other stuff that you do out in the world may or may not have anything to do with that. Like, you can have sort of religious activities, whereas traditional Catholic theology, traditional Islamic theology, Hinduism, like the notion that you have moments where it's like where you're doing non-godly things just doesn't track. And so Lutheranism, the Protestant Reformation, really launches the space that the Enlightenment opens up to say, oh, hey, look, you can have secular activities and you can have religious activities, and these can be different. And this is a debate today, even in the United States, to a certain extent. The conservative folks still don't buy this argument. They say, look, how can you have a nation state that believes in God and doesn't think that all policies and all decisions and all laws should be derived from God? It's just silly. Now, what those policies, everything can be, that's now you're in the land of theological arguments. But the argument between going, oh, no, these are actually separate spheres of influence, was a big religious battle, right? So even that underlining. So it's a good question and a good point, but be aware that even there you're talking in ground that was opened up by a theological argument in the Reformation in the West. This is different in China. It did not functional in India even today. And in fundamentalist Islamic countries is pretty much not there either.
Action asks, JFK was Catholic, so I think it's more likely that he was referring to the city on the hill as Athens, the birthplace of democracy, than as some kind of Protestant promised land. I think he's talking more about exporting democracy to the rest of the world versus a sort of export of a moral good.
Yeah. I mean, so his Catholicism doesn't matter. What matters is, why would something he say resonates, right? So this is always the thing to ask with political speech, or even, consumer speech. Why does some phrases, some concepts resonate with a society, whereas other phrases, concepts, ideas simply don't? So for instance, in France, liberty, equality, fraternity, everywhere you hear it all the time. We understand liberty. We have equality as a concept. We do not have fraternity as a concept. You can't talk about fraternity in the United States. It doesn't resonate. I mean, you can talk about it. I could talk about it. But this notion of fraternalism, it has no cultural echo. It's not going to get amplified. People are going to go, yeah, I feel what you mean when you say fraternalism. People are going to go, I have no idea what you're talking about. Like when you say, please explain, if they're interested, like, oh, explain fraternalism to me. Yeah, right. So in France, if you can say fraternalism, no one will ever say, "Oh, please explain that to me." I mean, because it would just be like, "What?" Like, of course, we all know what that means. Even if people can't articulate it, they feel as if they know what it means. So when JFK uses this language, him being Catholic doesn't matter. He could use all kinds of Catholic language that wouldn't resonate with 95% of the population, because even if they were Catholic, that might not resonate with them. But most of the population wasn't strongly enough Catholic for that to work. So it resonates because he has this concept that he's drawing on that is innate in American culture. And this notion of exporting, well, so this is moral good versus democracy. No, so this is why I say that's two sides of the same card. The moral good he wants to export is democracy. The
Mhm.
notion that your country is responsible for exporting moral goods is there it is, right? It's just sort of a whatever you think the moral good is it Calvinism, is it free markets, is it what it's like, oh, we should be in the business of making sure these other people are doing the right thing, and we should help them do the right thing, and we should set an example for them by doing the right things ourselves.
Mhm.
This is not a universal concept in world history. In fact, if you look at world history, this is not really a popular concept. The idea that you're supposed to export your way of life to other countries and convince them of things is like, you can kill them and take their shit. That's great. You can conquer them. Often when you conquered them, you didn't bother to make them change anything. You just said, look, we conquered you. This is the new governor, pay your taxes and give us some soldiers and we'll leave you alone. It's like, oh, okay, cool. But we don't care what you do. Like, we're just here to take your stuff and get a border or get some more troops or whatever our purpose is. But the notion that, oh, we should go in and transform a society, or we'd be an example for other people. See, this is that export of moral good, that we're better. Number one, we're exceptional. We know better because, of course, we're chosen of God. And therefore, when we say, we're going to do this, we believe it. And we do believe it. It's incredibly powerfully integrated. And if you want to know how different this is, imagine the president of, say, Nigeria. Nigeria's economy is booming. They've got a lot of people. They're a big country. They have oil. They're doing things. Standing up and saying, well, we need to explain to America how to change their government and have a better way of life. And so we're both going to be an example for that. And we're going to send some people over there to explain to them how to live the Nigerian dream.
Mhm. Got
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
Just they're not, most countries don't do this.
Mhm.
Surprisingly, or maybe surprisingly to us, I guess, but not surprisingly to most of the world.
Right. Lower Saxon basically is asking, does it feel different to live in a Catholic country? They say live in a Catholic country for some time and you'll literally feel the difference. And Wes, you currently live in a quote Catholic country. Is this true today? Was it truer back then?
Yeah, so this is important. Like, I guess I live in a formerly Catholic country, but it's so. One thing talking about secularism is, again, it's an important distinction. So secularism in the United States is freedom of religion. So right, so the idea that you have the freedom to choose whatever religion you want. In most, I would say, European countries, or at least many of them, secularism is freedom from religion, that religion has no place and no ability to interfere with your life. And if somebody wants to be religious, that's fine, but it's the same thing as someone wanting to collect trains,
Mm.
right? Like, it's a hobby. It's seen like, okay, that's over there. That's something that they do for some reason. We don't, we're not going to have anything to do with that.
Mhm.
So, these are different kinds of secularism, and this is one thing that confuses Americans, I think, is many countries that have gone through the Reformation or the Enlightenment reformations, or like a French Revolution or other revolutions, have come out very powerfully freedom from religion. Like, religion cannot interfere with your life in any way, as opposed to the US, which again is freedom of religion, where we assume people are going to be religious, but you just get to pick whatever religion you want. These are, and that this matters a lot in how this is understood and felt. So with that caveat, I do think that, well, I've asked a version of this question to many people who've lived in Italy and France and Spain, which were your big, sort of triple Catholic countries in Europe. And basically everybody says, yeah, they do feel different. Like, but it's hard to know though. Is this Catholicism? Is this history? What is it? But I think I just mentioned it, so I'll just follow up with that. In the statement of fraternity, I do think you have a strong resonance with the Catholic tradition, that when the Catholic Church was overthrown, you had to replace all of the social structures that the Catholic Church had been running. And it took a while to figure out what to do. But the idea was like, oh, we're all in this together. We're all one people. Before, there were three legal classes in France. And when the revolution got rid of that and said there's one class, we're all in this together. And then, of course, Napoleon made himself an emperor, but that's beside the point, right? The concept was that there's only one group of people. We're all, equal. And therefore, we're all brothers and sisters, fraternity. We're all one big family. We're not divided up into all these different groups and things. We're fundamentally one big family. And this is the Catholic Church argument. The Catholic Church says there's one world church. We're all members of that church, and everybody is a participant. Like that's the global. I mean, Catholic used to mean accepting of everything. We don't have that notion anymore. But the term Catholic, go back 100 years, this meant, oh, you accepted everything. So if you had Catholic tastes, that means, oh, you like a lot of different things. Or if that would just mean, oh, I like everything. So that model, that sort of intellectual concept, I think was passed on. But being in France is definitely very different. How much of that is because of Catholicism? It's hard for me to judge, but I do think those undercurrents are there, and you see it in a lot of the policy statements, the way things are organized. Because Catholicism was around for hundreds of years and deeply embedded into the culture, and so even when you got rid of the church, and then it came back, and then it got rid of it again, sort of back and forth, it's still prevalent as a social cultural presence. I guess here another example, which is very secular, but when they passed the law, so people stopped going to Catholic churches, right? So and the church used to be a state institution. So what do you do with all these beautiful historic Catholic cathedrals and churches all over France? I mean, no one goes, so they're just going to fall into disrepair. And so there's a date, and now I don't remember what that date is. It's like any church built before 1880 is owned by the state, which will maintain it, even if not a single Catholic person ever goes there. Churches built after that, the state isn't responsible. Like you can build a church if you want, but the state isn't going to take care of it. And so if you travel around France, all the Catholic churches are open almost all the time, and you can just go in, which as an American feels weird because I think of churches as being private spaces. So they aren't open to the public. In France, most of the churches, particularly all the old ones, are public facilities, weirdly maintained by the state, even they may or may not be active with like a Catholic community that still holds mass and stuff, but it doesn't matter. The state still maintains, repairs, upgrades, does all of this.
Mountain Wizard asks, Calvinism sounds like a precursor to social media. Calvinism plus smartphones equals something terrifying. What are your thoughts?
Well, I was trying to figure out yes. I mean, my first response is to say that sounds very reasonable. But social media is popular all over the place. So what would be interesting to see is if there was a way you could track down popularity in social media use by religious background. But I know it's huge in China, and they're not noted for being particularly Catholic or Protestant. So I think what happens with social media and Protestantism or Calvinism in particular, is the desire to be recognized communally is very strong. regardless. And I think both Calvinism and social media tap into this fundamental desire. And so I think, and Calvinism may reinforce that, but I don't think it's not causal. Like they both work because we have this very deep human need to be recognized and to feel that we are matter in our communities. And that's, I mean, Calvinism absolutely taps into that. Mormonism taps into this. All these attempts to make communities tap into this. And then if you look at social media, I mean, all the feedback is just, it's incredible how valuable people feel the feedback to be. And it is like, I get questions from people. I get questions from you guys that resonate with the kind of questions I like to think about. Whether my answers are any good, I have no idea. I hope they are, but these are the kinds of questions I like to think about. So it actually makes me feel good because I go, oh, there's other people who like to think about these kinds of crazy questions as well. And so it's like, oh yeah, this is great, right? It feels good. And that to me is what social media taps into, for good and ill. So I'm not opposed to it in theory. In practice, the way it's of course being deployed by major corporations is very ungood. Let us say it's not healthy for the humans. It's not being used to help people feel better or to feel healthier or to improve their lives. It's being used for exploitative and often self-destructive of the user purposes, which is the problem. Much like Calvinism, by the way, to go back there. I mean, I would not have wanted to live in Geneva. So what happens, of course, is people want the positive communal feedback. And so you basically become enslaved. And then everybody says, if you don't act as a slave, so it just exploits this fundamental need that people have. And to the point where at first you're like, oh yeah, this is great. We have some communal rules. We're all getting along. We're getting positive feedback. And then before you know it, it's like, well, we're going to have to burn you at the stake again because you're a witch and you're not playing along. And so I think that there are similarities there, but I don't think it's necessarily causal, I would say.
Okay. This is the last question. It's from @DoubtLeadsToTruth. It says, "Hi Wes, I love your videos. I was wondering if you would consider making a video about the differences between theology and philosophy."
Wow, that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, yes, that's a good. Write that down, Jeremy, and remind me like once a month to do that until I do it, because this is a great one. The short answer is, I would say, ideally, of course, the philosophy grows out of theology. So, and you can go. But by the way, if anybody hasn't read The Name of the Rose, this is such a great work that explores this subject, because the arguments that are made by these theologians in the early Catholic Church are so well explored in that novel. And you go, wow, these guys are actually just making philosophical arguments at some level. But fundamentally, theology starts with an answer, God, of this church, and then goes to a bunch of questions, right? So how do you respond to this? What does it mean? Philosophy starts with a question of some kind and tries to work towards an answer. I think that's kind of the thumbnail version of that. But theology, hence the theo, if you start with God, this solves so many problems already, right? Like it's like posit God, it's like, oh, okay, cool. That's helpful. It's like, okay, just imagine that, you were infinitely powerful. Now solve the world's problems. It's like, well, yeah, it's like, okay, that's a different set of questions than going, okay, imagine you're just a regular human being. Now solve the world's problems, right? Like, you start from a very different place when you don't start with the theo, right, with the God. And so that's fundamentally, you can't assume. In philosophy, you're not supposed to assume the existence of God. Although, boy, does it sneak in so many ways. I mean, in fact, this came up, I think, a little bit ago when I said, oh, this is our desire for one answer, which I always think is just this inculcation of monotheism. So I'm always afraid of things that have singular or simple or unified, clear-cut answers, because I'm like, am I falling in the monotheism trap? Because I know it's there, and I know it's in there. It's just we have to have a unity. Like, for instance, in physics, you can look at the Big Bang. Like, okay, there's this unitary moment when it springs into being. And you go, okay, there's a lot of evidence, something around that, but I'm just always suspicious of this, because that's like, yeah, that sounds just like monotheism to me. So but now, of course, all this new data is coming out that may not be exactly how things worked, and I'm like, oh yeah, it's going to be much messier. That seems more likely to be true to me, just because I'm always suspicious of monotheism as trying to shaping our thought. So yeah, so that's, but I should absolutely do that, because it's a great and nuanced question, right? Like there isn't a fine line, except maybe like if you can have a theological discussion without positing God, then it's probably just philosophy. But that would be, I'll have to ponder that. Maybe you can, but I'm not sure.
Right. And within philosophy, there's the subsect of metaphysics that sort of feels like it comes closer to theology or talking about God or something like that. And I've always been curious about this question. I thought it was a good one.
Yeah, and maybe that's a good way to phrase it too. Is theology, metaphysics, philosophy, right? By the way, I mean, I hate to say it, but that's Kant, Immanuel fucking Kant. He's so good, and he's so impossible to read, right? Like, because this is he is plowing this field and getting so much work out of it. It's amazing. But he's just so evil to try and read that I just like, he's endlessly frustrating. But points to him, because he was trying to think his way out of this unbelievable tangle on his own out there in the middle of whatever, Königsberg and 1700s. I mean, wow, unbelievably hard work. So yeah, it's a tough one. But yeah, that would be a great one. I think theology, metaphysics, and philosophy. How can you get there from here? And by the way, this is where Nietzsche comes in, because he was, in a way, trying to kill all metaphysics, which turns out to be difficult, but also revolutionary if you can pull it off, even to a limited degree.
Well, thank you, Wes, and thank you, listeners.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. And yeah, website up. I'll put a link below. Please sign up if you're thinking, just so I can, sleep at night, because that would be that would be cool. No, it's all good. We've got people signed up, and we'll just keep rolling. All right, thanks again, Jeremy. And again, thanks for the questions. Really, really interesting. I'm glad people were interested in sort of the theological side of things, because the history of the influence of religious ideas on secular society is just amazing. So, all right. Thanks. Until next time. Thanks, Jeremy.